I'm going to suggest this morning that it's a combination of a number of elements of human psychology, in particular a number of emotional biases and cognitive biases, interacting with the nature of news. So let's start with the psychology. There are a number of emotional biases toward pessimism that have been well documented by psychologists. Often summarized by the slogan, "Bad is stronger than good." This is the title of a review article by Roy Baumeister that came out a dozen years ago, in which he reviewed a wide variety of kinds of evidence that people are more sensitive to bad things than to good things. Losses are felt more keenly than gains. If you lose $10, that makes you feel a lot worse than the amount by which you feel better if you gain $10. Or as Jimmy Connors once put it, "I hate to lose more than I like to win." Bad events leave longer traces than good ones in terms of mood and memory. Criticism hurts more than praise encourages. This is just the tip of an iceberg of psychological phenomena in which the bad outweighs the good. Bad information is processed, whoops, sorry, I got that cut off at the bottom of the slide, is processed more attentively than good information. Well, why is bad stronger than good? I suspect that there is a deep and profound reason, namely the second law of thermodynamics. That is, that there are more ways in which the state of the world can be disordered than ordered, almost by definition, or in the more vernacular version, shit happens. There are a lot more ways in which something can go wrong than something can go right. So here's a question. This was originally posed to me by my late colleague Amos Tversky when I was at Stanford. Just imagine, a little thought experiment. As you leave this conference, how many really good things could happen to you today? Just let your imagination run wild, the best things that you could imagine. Okay? Now, how many really bad things could happen to you today? Imagine all the terrible things that could happen. And I think you'll agree that the second list is longer than the first one. And not surprisingly, this probably has left a mark on our psychology. And Tversky also posed the following two thought experiments. How much better could you feel than you're feeling right now? Again, try to imagine how much happier you could be. Now, how much worse could you feel than you're feeling right now? You don't even have to do the experiment. There's also an asymmetry of payoffs in terms of the reaction to the possibility of good and bad things. What is the average cost of overreacting to a threat? Well, it's not zero, and we all can document cases where we have paid in foregone opportunities or in other resources for reacting to a threat that never happens. But what's the cost of underreacting to a threat, such as an accident, a predator, a disease, and so on? There's a hypothesis, not so easy to prove, but I think quite plausible, and I bet it could be proven, that for most of human evolutionary history, the fitness cost of underreaction was much greater than the fitness cost of overreaction. That is, that the typical threat in the environment in which our brains evolved was probably greater than it is today, now that we have exerted technological mastery over so much of our local environment. The implication would be that our current psychology is tuned to a world that was more dangerous than the world that we're in today, and that therefore our sense of risk and fear and anxiety is not optimally tuned to the objective risks that we face today. Now, this could be multiplied by a second source of bias, sometimes called the illusion of the good old days. People always pine for a golden age. They're nostalgic about an era in which life was simpler, more predictable. And Roger Ibach has argued that this is because people confuse changes in themselves with changes in the times. Now, as we get older, there are just certain things that inevitably happen to us. We take on more responsibilities, so we have a greater cognitive burden. We become more vigilant about threats, especially as we become parents. I mean, one of the experiences of a new parent is they never realized how much the world is filled with threats and dangers. You know, an empty paint bucket could be lethal to a toddler. We become more sensitive to more kinds of errors. This is certainly true in language. As you become more literate, as you consume more printed text, you become more sensitive to some of the fine points of punctuation and spelling and grammar that you may not have noticed when you had consumed less text, and so you're more likely to notice errors in text that you process in the future. And at the same time, we see our own capabilities decline. We become stupider as we get older in terms of just sheer ability to process information. And there is a strong tendency to misattribute many of these changes in ourselves to changes in the world. And there are a number of experimental manipulations that bear this out. If you have people try to make some change in their lives, say to eat less fat, then they are convinced that there are more and more ads for fatty foods. If you ask them to reduce carbohydrates, they're convinced that the number of ads for high-carb foods goes up. So it's an experimental manipulation as well as a post hoc observation. Now, it would be a little hypocritical if I said, more and more today, people pine for the good old days. But there's reason to think that this is not a recent phenomenon, that the good old days illusion is itself nothing new. In 1777, David Hume noted that the humor of blaming the present and admiring the past is strongly rooted in human nature. And I think another one of the causes, on top of the emotional biases that I have reviewed, was suggested a century earlier by Thomas Hobbes, who wrote pithily, "Competition of praise inclineth to a reverence of antiquity, for men contend with the living, not with the dead." That is, criticizing the present is a way of criticizing your rivals. And that ties into the third emotional bias, which is the psychology of moralization. People compete for moral authority. Who is more noble? And critics are seen as more morally engaged than apologists, or people who are simply apathetic, particularly regarding contested ideas and institutions in your local social community. And people identify with moral tribes. What you think is worthy of moralization identifies which group you affiliate with. And so the factual question, is the world getting better or worse, has become a referendum on modernity. That is, on the gradual erosion over the centuries of family, tribe, tradition, and religion, and giving way to the forces of individualism, cosmopolitanism, reason, and science. So your factual belief on whether the world is getting better or worse is a litmus test for your moral beliefs on what kinds of institutions and ideas make us better off and worse off. Those are three emotional biases. I think we also have cognitive biases that incline us toward pessimism. Foremost among them, the availability heuristic, a feature of our psychology of probability estimation documented by Amos Tversky in collaboration with Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist and author of Thinking Fast and Slow, the bestseller. Kahneman and Tversky argued 40 years ago that one of the ways the human brain estimates probability is by the rule of thumb that the more easily you can recall an example of something, the more probable you estimate it to be, with the result that anything that makes an incident more memorable will make it seem more probable. And here is and that means that any factor of human memory, the quirks of the brain's ability to retain information, will bleed over to our estimate of risk and likelihood. So events that are more recent will be judged to come from more probable categories. Things that are easier to imagine, form a picture in the mind's eye, and things that are easier to retrieve. And they give a simple example. Which are more common, words that begin with the letter R or words that have R in the third position? Now, people will say it's more likely that a word will begin with R than to have R in the third position. They looked it up. It's the other way around. But not surprisingly, we retrieve words by their onsets. We don't retrieve words by their third position. So you can ask this of almost any letter in the alphabet, and you'll get the same result. We just can't call words up to mind by any position than the first. And so we always judge words that begin with a particular letter to be more common than words that have a letter in any other position, just because of the quirks of human memory. Now, needless to say, even though on average things that occur more often will be more memorable, in any case where that fails to happen, our estimates of probability will be systematically incorrect. Or another way of putting it is that the cognitive psychology of human memory is not the same as the calculation of probability, which is more or less number of occurrences divided by number of opportunities in the long run. We see the availability heuristic in action all the time. People are more fearful of plane crashes, shark attacks, and terrorist bombings, especially if one just happened recently, compared to events like electrocutions, falls, and drownings, which are objectively far greater risks, but tend not to make the headlines. Then there's the Pauline Kael effect. In 1972, after the biggest electoral landslide in American presidential history, Pauline Kael, the movie critic of the New Yorker, said, "I don't understand how Nixon could have won the election. No one that I know voted for him." Now, I think all of these psychological biases interact with the nature of news to lead to an overall aura of pessimism. What is news? News is, pretty much by definition, things that happen. It's not things that don't happen. If something blows up, that's news. If something doesn't blow up, that's not news. If a high school gets shot up, that's news. If there's another high school that doesn't get shot up, you don't see a reporter in front with a camera and a news truck saying there hasn't been a rampage shooting in front of this high school, or the other thousands and thousands of high schools at which a rampage shooting has not taken place. So the news is inherently biased toward violent events because violent events are events, and nonviolence is just not an event. Now, this is, I think, an even greater distorter than the commonly repeated criticism of news programming policy: if it bleeds, it leads. Although, of course, that is a policy to be made aware of and to criticize. Violence is entertaining. We pay a reasonable amount of our disposable income to watch things like Shakespearean tragedies and movies in which people get shot and blown up. It's not surprising that when it comes to attracting eyeballs to news sites, the same kind of mayhem that we pay money to see fictionalized, we also pay money to see in fact. Also, I think this is multiplied by the fact that the world now has 1.75 billion smartphones, increasing exponentially, which means that the world now has 1.75 billion news reporters. So violent and gory events that would have been trees falling in the forest with no one to hear them as recently as a decade ago now can be filmed in real time and uploaded to the World Wide Web. And all of these traits of the news media stoke the availability heuristic. That is, they give us imaginable, vivid, memorable, recent events to tilt our probability estimates. Final point is that this can in turn give rise to a perverse violence news codependency, in which people will commit acts of violence precisely because they anticipate how it will be covered in the news. There are at least two categories of violence which are pretty much creations of the news media. Terrorism. Terrorism is a technology for extracting the maximum amount of publicity for the smallest amount of violence. By any count, terrorism accounts for a trivial proportion of the world's deaths by violence, to say nothing of deaths from all causes put together. The most damaging terrorist event in history was 9/11, which killed fewer than 3,000 people. I mean, that's kind of in the noise when it comes to statistics on homicide or civil wars. And rampage killings. That's another event which probably would not occur, or not nearly as much, if it weren't for the wall-to-wall news coverage. The way Adam Lankford put it in his book, The Myth of Martyrdom, Here's a thought experiment. Let's say you wanted to be famous. You really wanted to attain worldwide fame in, say, in some period of time, let's say in the next year or the next week or the next month. What could you do that would guarantee that you would become famous? Well, it'd be nice to come up with a cure of a disease, but how many of us can do that? Even circulating an internet meme, a cat video. There are lots of people who are uploading cat videos. Very few of them go viral. But he noted that there is one guaranteed way in which any person in this room could be famous, and that is kill a lot of innocent people. Now, because of that feature of life, a market is created for people for whom notoriety is more important than anything else, including life itself. And that feeds a kind of violence that probably would barely exist if it weren't for the nature of news.